We want to move to the mayoral race here in New York City. Obviously, the Democratic primary attracted quite a bit of attention, notably so, of course, New York, the largest city in the United States. Eric Adams was the victor there. For many people, that means that the race is over, but the reality is the race is not over by any stretch of the imagination. Eric Adams is currently being challenged by Cathy Rojas, who is a socialist candidate with the Party for Socialism and Liberation in the mayoral race. And we are very honored to be joined here by Cathy Rojas. Cathy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me and having me here. I appreciate it.
No, the pleasure is all ours. So, I guess I'll just ask you the most obvious question first, Cathy. Why are you running for mayor of New York City?
Well, I think as someone that lived through COVID-19 in one of the epicenters of COVID-19, I was living in Elmhurst, Queens, a few blocks from Elmhurst Hospital, where there were, trucks, refrigerated trucks parked outside just 1 or 2 blocks away from my house with the bodies of my neighbors, of my community, of the parents of my students, right? And the reason that they were there wasn't so much so because of COVID-19 per se, but it was because of the neglect that this government had in our communities, right? The lack of aid for undocumented workers, the lack of access to adequate housing. We had 8, in a lot of places, we had 8 people living in one room. How can people quarantine if they don't have adequate housing? For 9 years, hospitals have been shutting down in Queens throughout the entire New York City. So then the only public hospital that we had in the area was Elmhurst Hospital. If you don't have insurance, most immigrants don't. It's an immigrant community. Where can you go? You can only go to Elmhurst Hospital. They had more people than they were able to serve. And therefore that caused a lot of deaths in our community. So I think that COVID-19 made it clear that for us, for New Yorkers, this race was life or death because, we had thousands and thousands of deaths in New York City, and they could have all been prevented if we would have put the interests of working class people in the forefront. And only a socialist mayor can do that.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I maybe buried the lead a little bit there. You mentioned your students. You're also a public school teacher. I'm really glad that you brought up the issue of COVID-19 and the impact on New York because, you weren't just in the middle of it, but you were also working, I know, doing organizing and engaging with people. Talk about that a little bit because I think a lot of times people talk about experience in these mayoral races, and I think that's a really very significant bit of experience in terms of our current situation here in New York.
Right. Well, in terms of, my work as a teacher and as a community organizer, one of the things that happened was that I work in a school that's 100% immigrant. Many of my students and their families are undocumented. They couldn't qualify for any aid. Their families became sick with COVID-19 and they couldn't go outside. They didn't have any money. They had to pay rent, all of these things. So what did we do? We started with Centro Corona. Shout out to Centro Corona. We started a weekly grocery delivery drive where we were literally buying food in bulk based, and we use actually Cuba's rationing model on how many calories each person should receive based on how many family members they had. And then we basically created boxes that we would deliver every single week to ensure that our families were fed. On top of that, I was spending hours upon hours helping families apply for grants, for nonprofit grants, GoFundMe grants, things of the sort. And then there was just the regular part of teaching, right? That students didn't have access to Wi-Fi. We had to be on the phone for hours. I'm talking about hours on hold with Spectrum just to get a student free Wi-Fi, right? When really the government could have just opened, the broadband and given free Wi-Fi to everyone. But because Wi-Fi is privatized, we had to be on the phone for hours. And these are all teachers doing this, trying to get our students Wi-Fi. In terms of rent, even during the eviction moratorium, I had to be on the phone with landlords explaining, we are in a eviction moratorium. You can't evict your tenants right now. If they're small landlords, I explained to them, the benefits that they can have if they called their mortgage company and maybe had their mortgage stop for a few months. But it was really non-stop work for our community and for me as an organizer in an immigrant community all throughout 2020. I mean, it's only slowing down now. We have the fund excluded workers that just opened on August 1st. But the eviction moratoriums already getting lifted, and only 5% of rent relief has actually been dispersed. The excluded workers funds haven't been dispersed yet. So if you were undocumented and missed pay, you don't have any aid and you can still be evicted. So, we're still fighting every single day for the livelihood of our community.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Cathy,
go ahead, Rania.
Well, I was curious, I was curious, it can't be easy to run in a place like New York City, which is obviously dominated by the big political parties. One, I guess I would ask, how receptive are people to the message? I imagine quite receptive, because the kinds of things that a socialist would talk about are things that average people, affect their lives and would make them better. But also in terms of being able to get your message out, I mean, are you not being a Republican or Democrat going to be able to participate in, for example, a debate? Are you able to get the kinds of platforms, like our mainstream outlets coming and asking you about what your platform is? Or is it a very difficult situation to try to get that attention?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely in terms of our outreach and when we're out in the community talking to people, everybody's receptive. We are in working class communities. We are in communities that are facing eviction. So when we're talking about canceling the rents and mortgages, that's something that will benefit everyone. Housing has been an issue in New York City before the pandemic. It's going to be an issue after the pandemic, and we have long-term solutions. We're looking at how to make New York City a rent control city where, they can't be charged more than 20% of their income for rent or for housing. And when we look at right now, people, there was a shooting in Corona, Queens. 10 people were shot in one day. That was all over the news. The Republican candidate was saying we need to expand the gang database, and the fault is on undocumented immigrants. Eric Adams is saying that we need to expand the NYPD. I teach in that community. I grew up around that community, and I went out there to speak to people. They don't want more police. This is an immigrant community where, any interaction with the police can lead to deportation, right? So I explained to them our plan for violence intervention programs, for mentoring youth, for creating classes on conflict resolution, for jobs, creating jobs for youth and for everyone in the community. And they expressed how much better of a plan that would be. But these plans need to be funded. So when we're talking about reallocating funds from the NYPD, we're talking about reallocating them to systems and structures that work in minimizing violence in our community, work in terms of, supporting and empowering and transforming our communities, as opposed to criminalizing them. So these are all of the points in our platform, including fully funding the infrastructure of the MTA through taxing the rich. These are all things that will benefit New Yorkers. So all New Yorkers have been in support of our platform. Yes, it has been very, very hard to get the mainstream media to pay attention to our campaign. We are sending out press releases and statements on a daily basis. When we go to actions, we're always trying to get the press to interview us so that we could show our perspective. At the end of the day, this is known to be a two-party system, supposedly democratic, right? And we're running as a third party, right? In terms of the debate, we need to have I think it's $150,000 of donations in order to participate in the debate.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a donation threshold in order to participate. So unless we are rich or we pander to the rich, we can't really participate because we're not making that level of donation. But that goes to show that they limit these elections so much so that they want anyone that truly has the interest of working class people and truly has an allegiance to working class people, that they are kind of barred as much as they can, that they're trying to bar us as much as they can in the media and in debates, so that nobody hears our perspective, because they know that if people hear our perspective, they will be moved to fight and struggle for transformation and liberation in New York City.
Well, I'm glad you raised this issue of, the rich and the impact that they play on New York. I mean, would you say that one of the biggest, maybe defining factors of this race is that, of course, Eric Adams is getting all the support from Wall Street, is whether or not we're going to continue I think what many people would call business as usual here in the United States with the Wall Street companies and the real estate investors, or whether or not we're going to have some level of empowerment and voice for working class people?
Yeah, definitely. Eric Adams has received $11 million in donations from real estate developers, from police unions, from all of the organizations that are known to oppress the very same working class people that he's supposedly going to represent. So I urge people, track where the money's coming from. How is it so that he's saying he's going to create a better New York for working class people while he's taking money from the same people that oppress them? It's impossible, because that's going to be his allegiance to them once he takes office. And our role is to fight that at every level, right? To talk to people in the streets. We have people in all 5 boroughs doing outreach, speaking to community members. We are going to protest. We're talking to community organizations. We're speaking to progressive nonprofits about endorsements. And at every level, we are doing everything we can so that people see our platform, so that they know about our platform, and they know that a different reality is possible and realistic for New York, as long as we fight for it. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who wins. What matters is whether or not New York City working class people can unite to fight for what they need to survive, and to fight against the capitalist class that will always put the interests of the rich instead of their lives first.
Well, I think that's an important point that you raised there, and it brings me to, I think, what's been another big conversation about the city of New York City, but the state of New York, and that is, in many ways, New York has become sort of the center of socialist politics in the United States. And there's a lot of exciting things, people talking about India Walton in Buffalo and other things like that. So, I mean, are you placing your race here in this broader context of not just the city, but also the state and the country, and the need for a bigger and a broader change for working class people?
Absolutely. I mean, we're just getting out of a 20-year war, right, that did nothing but destabilize Afghanistan, loot the resources of the country, kill 150,000 people in Afghanistan. It caused the death of, I believe it was 6,000 American soldiers, and it cost the country. And when I talk about the country, I'm talking about our money, our tax dollars. It cost our tax dollars $2.23 trillion. Now, with that, we could have paid all the back due rent in the United States. We could have paid for student debt for a bachelor's degree. We could have paid for healthcare, for housing, for all of the necessities that our people have, right? So, but yet, the United States on a local level and on a federal level always chooses to fund oppression, to fund militarization, instead of protecting the social services that we need. So I think that throughout the United States, but really throughout the planet, our country will benefit from a socialist government.
Well, one thing I just want to say for people who may be liking what you have to say, where can people find your campaign?
Yes, so people could go on Rojas 4, so that's Rojas and then the number 4, mayor.nyc. They can follow me on Instagram at Rojas4, number 4, mayor, or they could follow me on Twitter on Rojas4 Mayor 2021.
Excellent. Well, Cathy Rojas, candidate for mayor in New York City from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, we really appreciate you coming on and telling us a little bit about your run.
Thank you for having me.